The old research station floated silently above planet Verdania, and its metal walls were covered in dust and rust after 300 years of abandonment. And inside the empty corridors whispered stories of failure and death, and every species in the galaxy knew this place as the graveyard of ambitions. Commander Lisa Morgan pressed her hand against the cold window of her ship and watched the planet turn slowly below, and from space it looked like a perfect emerald spinning in the darkness, and the green was so rich and vibrant that it seemed to glow with its own inner light, and thick white clouds drifted across the surface. Hiding mysteries beneath her dragon Ember sensed her thoughts and lifted her head from where she lay coiled on the warm floor, and the dragon's scales shimmered with colors that shifted from deep red to bright orange, and she made a soft chirping sound that meant curiosity mixed with caution. Lisa smiled and reached down to scratch behind Ember's horns, and the dragon was young, only 20 years old. But she was wise beyond her age, and she had been with Lisa since she hatched from her egg, and they understood each other without words, most of the time. The rest of the crew was gathered in the common room, and they were reviewing the mission files one last time before the landing, and Lieutenant Amy Chen sat cross-legged on a bench with her dragon Spark curled in her lap, and Spark was smaller than Ember, with bright blue scales that sparkled like sapphires, and he was playful and curious and always getting into things he should not touch. Dr. Rebecca Torres stood at the display screen scrolling through pages of data, and her dragon Cinder rested on her shoulders like a living scarf, and Cinder was the oldest of the 3 dragons at 35 years, and her dark purple scales were marked with silver patterns that looked like stars, and she rarely made sounds, but when she did, everyone listened. Rebecca looked up as Lisa entered the room, and her expression was serious, and she said, "The records are worse than I thought, and 17 expeditions tried to settle here, and none lasted more than 6 months, and most were gone within weeks." Amy leaned forward and asked, "What killed them?" and her voice was steady, but her hand moved to stroke Spark's head, and the little dragon purred softly. Rebecca touched the screen, and images appeared showing abandoned settlements, and the buildings were torn apart by something with immense strength, and metal walls were bent and broken, and in some places the jungle had grown through the structures so completely that they looked like they had been there for centuries instead of months. The reports mentioned several things, she continued, and first there were the predators, and the local animals hunted in organized packs, and they used tactics that suggested intelligence. And second, the plants themselves seemed hostile, and they would grow overnight and strangle equipment and block pathways and trap explorers. Lisa crossed her arms and asked, "What about the green fever?" and everyone had heard of it, and it was the thing that scared the other species most. Rebecca nodded slowly, and that is the strangest part. And every expedition reported the same symptoms, and within 2 weeks of landing, crew members would start acting strange, and they reported hearing voices and seeing things that were not there and feeling emotions that were not their own, and most became violent or catatonic, and the few who escaped said the planet was trying to get inside their heads. The room fell quiet, and even the dragons seemed to sense the weight of the conversation, and Ember stood up and walked to Lisa's side, pressing her warm body against her leg. "But humans are different," Amy said softly, "and we have survived worse, and Earth taught us how to adapt." Lisa looked at her crew and felt pride in their courage, and they knew the risks, and they had volunteered anyway. And the Galactic Council had been surprised when humans asked for permission to attempt what 17 other species had failed, and some council members thought humans were foolish, and others thought they were brave, and a few thought they might actually succeed. Truth was that humans had a reputation now, and in the 50 years since they joined the galactic community, they had done things that other species considered impossible, and they had tamed worlds that were deemed too hostile, and they had befriended creatures that were thought to be mindless beasts, and they had solved problems by thinking in ways that other species never considered. Lisa pulled up the mission plan and said, "We land tomorrow at dawn, and we will set up camp near the stream in Sector 7 in the clearing. There is large enough for our equipment and close to water, and we follow standard protocols but with modifications, and we do not cut down trees unless absolutely necessary, and we do not use weapons unless attacked. And we treat this planet like a living thing because the evidence suggests it might actually be." One Rebecca raised an eyebrow and said, "You think the whole planet is alive?" And one organism Lisa shrugged and said, I think something is here that we do not understand yet, and every species that came before us treated Verdania like an enemy to be conquered. And maybe that was their mistake, and maybe we should try something different. Amy grinned and said, "So we are going camping on the most dangerous planet in known space." "Exactly," Lisa replied, "and we are going to roast marshmallows and tell stories and see what happens." The crew laughed and the tension broke, and even the dragons seemed to relax, and they spent the rest of the evening preparing their gear and checking their supplies and saying goodbye to the support crew who would remain on the ship. That night Lisa could not sleep, and she stood at the window again watching Verdania. And Ember came to stand beside her and the dragons. Presence was comforting and warm. Tomorrow they would land, and tomorrow they would discover if humans could succeed, where everyone else had failed. And tomorrow they would learn the truth about the jungle. Planet, Ember made a soft rumbling sound deep in her chest, and Lisa knew what she meant, and the dragon was ready, and whatever waited below they would face it together. The planet turned silently in the darkness, and somewhere far below in the depths of the endless green jungle, something ancient stirred and became aware. And after 300 years of silence, something new was coming, and this time it would be different. The landing shuttle broke through the clouds at sunrise, and the jungle spread out beneath them like an ocean of green. And from this height, Lisa could see how dense it was, and there were no breaks in the canopy except for the clearing they had chosen and a few scattered lakes that gleamed like mirrors in the early light. Ember pressed against the window beside her and made excited clicking sounds, and the dragon had never seen anything like this. And Earth had forests, but nothing compared to the sheer size and wildness of Verdania, and this was a jungle that had never known the touch of civilization. The shuttle descended slowly, and the pilot was careful to avoid the tallest trees, and as they got closer, Lisa could see movement in the canopy, and something large and dark shifted between the branches and then disappeared, and she felt her heart beat faster, but kept her breathing calm. They landed in the clearing with a soft thump, and for a moment everyone sat still and listened, and the jungle was loud, and there were sounds of birds or something like birds, and the rustle of leaves and strange calls that echoed through the trees, and underneath it all was a deep, humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Lisa stood and said, "Let us meet our new home," and the crew cheered, and the dragons roared softly in response. The ramp lowered, and warm, humid air rushed into the shuttle, and it smelled of earth and growing things and rain, and something else that Lisa could not identify, and it was not unpleasant, just different and alien and old. She stepped out first with Ember at her side, and the ground was soft beneath her boots and covered in a carpet of moss that felt like walking on foam, and the clearing was roughly circular, about 50 meters across, and a stream ran along one edge with water so clear she could see the stones at the bottom. Amy came down the ramp next with Spark flying circles above her head, and the little dragon was showing off and diving and climbing and making happy sounds, and Rebecca followed with Cinder on her shoulders, and the older dragon's eyes were sharp and watchful. The rest of the crew brought out equipment and supplies, and they worked quickly and efficiently, and they had done this before on other worlds, but never one quite like this. And Lieutenant Jake Morrison was their botanist, and he immediately walked to the edge of the clearing and knelt to examine the plants, and he had a small scanner in his hand and was muttering to himself about cellular structures and growth patterns. Corporal Nina Stevens was their security officer, and she set up a perimeter of sensors around the camp, and they would alert them if anything large approached, and she moved with quiet confidence, and her dragon Blaze stayed close to her, and his red and gold scales made him look like living fire. Dr. Kevin Park was their medical officer, and he established a small clinic area under a waterproof tarp, and he was prepared for injuries and illnesses and the mysterious green fever that had driven other explorers mad. Within 2 hours they had camp set up, and there were 6 large tents arranged in a circle, and a central fire pit, and a cooking area, and equipment stations, and it looked more like a camping trip than a military expedition, and that was intentional. Lisa gathered everyone together and said, "Remember the plan, and we are guests here, not conquerors, and we take only what we need, and we give back when we can, and we watch and we listen and we try to understand before we act." The crew nodded, and they understood, and this was the human way, and they had learned long ago that making friends was often more effective than making war. That first day, passed without incident, and Jake collected plant samples and took careful notes, and Nina patrolled the perimeter and found tracks of something large, but nothing approached, and Rebecca set up her lab and began analyzing the soil and water, and Kevin treated minor cuts and scrapes from unpacking. Amy spent the afternoon at the edge of the clearing with Spark, and she sat very still and just watched the jungle, and after a while she noticed that the plants near her were swaying, and there was no wind, and they seemed to be bending toward her as if curious. She spoke softly and said, "Hello, and we come in peace and we want to learn about you." And Spark chirped in agreement. The swaying stopped and then started again, and it looked almost like the plants were waving back as evening approached. Lisa started a fire in the central pit, and the crew gathered around and they cooked dinner and told stories and laughed, and the dragons lay near the flames soaking up the warmth. And it felt surreal to be having such a normal moment on a planet that had killed so many. Rebecca brought her findings to Lisa and said, "I have been studying the plant samples, and there is something unusual, and the cellular structure is more complex than anything I have seen, and there are what look like neural pathways, and not in individual plants, but connecting between them." Lisa frowned and asked, "What does that mean?" Rebecca chose her words carefully and said, "It means the plants might be networked and sharing information and possibly even thoughts, and if I am right, the entire jungle could be one massive organism." The implications were staggering, and if the jungle was a single living thinking entity, then every previous expedition had been attacking it, and no wonder it fought back. That night Lisa could not sleep again, and she sat by the dying fire with Ember and watched the jungle, and in the darkness she could see tiny lights moving between the trees, and they looked like fireflies, but there were thousands of them, and they pulsed in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Ember stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, and she stared into the darkness. And then she did something unexpected, and she began to glow, and her scales lit up from within with warm orange and red light, and she pulsed the light in a rhythm, and it was beautiful and strange. The fireflies responded, and their lights began to pulse in the same rhythm. Lisa held her breath and watched, and Ember was trying to communicate, and the dragon was using light instead of sound, and after a few minutes the pattern changed and the fireflies created new rhythms, and Ember copied them. They were having a conversation. Amy emerged from her tent and stood beside Lisa, and she whispered, "What is she doing?" "Talking," Lisa replied, "and I think she is talking to the jungle." They watched for another hour as Ember and the lights exchanged patterns, and finally the dragon returned to Lisa's side and made a satisfied sound, and curled up by the fire. Amy said quietly, "I think we are being watched, and not just by animals but by something bigger, and I can feel it." Lisa nodded and said, "I feel it too, and tomorrow we will try to make contact, and we will show the jungle that we are not like the others." The night was full of sounds, and the jungle sang and hummed and whispered, and somewhere deep in the forest, something ancient listened and wondered and waited. The humans had been here for one day, and they had not cut down trees or poisoned the water or built walls, and they had made fire and told stories, and one of their dragons had tried to speak. This was new, and this was interesting, and the jungle decided to wait and watch and see what these strange creatures would do next. Morning came with mist rising from the stream and the jungle dripping with dew, and Lisa woke to find the clearing had changed overnight, and vines with purple flowers had grown over the edge of their tents, and a path had appeared in the undergrowth, where there had been only thick vegetation the day before. She stood slowly and looked around, and the crew was emerging from their tents, and everyone noticed the changes, and Jake was already at the vines examining them with wide eyes, and he called out, "These grew in one night. And that should be impossible, and the growth rate would require energy levels that do not make sense." Rebecca joined him and scanned the flowers, and she said, "Unless the entire jungle is feeding energy into them. And if, my theory is correct, the whole organism could direct resources to specific areas, and like a body sending blood to an injury." Amy walked to the new path, and Spark flew ahead investigating, and she called back, "It leads deeper into the jungle, and it looks intentional, and like someone rolled out a carpet for us." Lisa made a decision and said, "We follow it, and we take only what we can carry, and we leave most equipment here, and if the jungle is inviting us, we should accept." Nina objected, saying, It could be a trap, and we do not know what is out there. Lisa understood the concern but said if the jungle wanted us dead, it could have killed us last night, and we were asleep and vulnerable, and instead it grew flowers and made a path. And I think it is curious about us. They prepared quickly, and Lisa took Ember and Amy took Spark, and Rebecca insisted on coming with Cinder, and Nina came for security with Blaze. And Jake came because he could not resist studying the plants, and Kevin stayed behind to watch the camp with the remaining crew. The path wound through the jungle, and it was wide enough for two people to walk side by side, and the ground was covered in soft moss, and overhead the canopy filtered the sunlight into green and gold patterns, and the air smelled like rain and flowers and earth. They walked for an hour, and the jungle was alive with sound, and Lisa heard things moving in the trees, and saw shadows that might have been animals, or might have been something else, and once she saw eyes watching from the undergrowth, and they glowed with a soft blue light, and then blinked and disappeared. Ember stayed close to Lisa, and the dragon's head moved constantly, tracking sounds and scents, and occasionally she made soft chirping sounds that seemed to be reassuring. The path led them to a massive tree, and it was larger than any tree Lisa had ever seen, and the trunk was so wide that 20 people holding hands could not encircle it, and the bark was silver and covered in patterns that looked like writing, and the branches spread out so far they created their own forest within the forest. At the base of the tree was a pool of water, and it was perfectly circular, and the surface was still and reflective, like glass, and around the pool grew flowers of every color, and they seemed to glow with inner light. Rebecca stepped forward and said, "This is the center, and I can feel it, and this is the heart of the organism." Jake was scanning everything, and his equipment was making excited beeping sounds, and he said the energy readings here are off the charts, and there is something in the water and some kind of chemical compound I have never seen before. Amy knelt by the pool and looked at her reflection, and Spark landed on her shoulder and chirped softly, and she said it is beautiful and it feels sacred. Somehow, Lisa approached the pool, and Ember came with her, and the dragon extended her neck and sniffed the water, and then she did something that made Lisa's heart stop, and Ember drank from the pool. Lisa started to pull her back, but Ember made a reassuring sound, and her eyes were calm, and after a moment nothing bad happened, and the dragon looked at Lisa and made an encouraging sound. Lisa understood, and the jungle was offering them something, and Ember had accepted, and now it was Lisa's turn. She knelt and cupped her hands and lifted water to her lips, and it tasted like nothing and everything, and it was cool and sweet, and as soon as she swallowed, she felt something change. The world became sharper and brighter, and she could feel the jungle around her, and it was not just plants and animals, but one vast consciousness, and it was old and patient and curious, and it had been alone for so long. Images flooded her mind, and she saw the other expeditions through the jungle's memory, and she saw ships landing and machines cutting into the earth, and chemicals poured into the streams, and fire used to burn away vegetation, and the jungle had defended itself, and it had driven them mad by trying to communicate, and their minds could not handle the connection. But humans were different, and human minds were flexible and adaptable, and when the connection formed, it did not break them. Lisa opened her eyes and found the others staring at her, and she realized she had been standing still for several minutes, and tears were running down her face. She said, "Drink, and it is safe, and it wants to talk to us one by one." They drank, and one by one they felt the connection form, and Rebecca gasped and said, "I can feel it, and every plant and every animal, and it is all one, and it is beautiful." Jake laughed with wonder and said, "The intelligence here rivals any species in the galaxy, and maybe exceeds it. And this is not a planet. This is a person." Amy closed her eyes and said, "It is lonely. And it has been lonely for millions of years, and it tried to talk to the others, but they could not understand." Nina stood very still and said, "It knows we are different, and it knows we come from a world where life learned to coexist, and it wants to know if we can teach it how to talk to other species." Lisa felt the weight of responsibility, and she said, "We will try, and we will be the bridge." The jungle responded with gratitude, and suddenly the flowers around the pool bloomed, and their scent filled the air, and it smelled like joy. They spent hours by the pool learning and teaching, and the jungle showed them its history, and it had been created by an ancient race millions of years ago as an experiment in planetary consciousness. But the creators had disappeared, and the jungle had been alone ever since. It showed them the predators, and they were not separate creatures but extensions of the jungle itself, and like white blood cells protecting a body, and when threatened, they responded with violence. But when treated with respect, they could be gentle. It showed them the network of roots and fungus and bacteria that connected every living thing on the planet, and sharing nutrients and information and creating a mind that spanned continents. And the humans shared their own stories, and they showed the jungle earth and forests and oceans and cities, and they showed it humanity's long journey from tribal ancestors to spacefaring civilization, and they showed it both the beauty and ugliness of their history. The jungle understood, and it saw that humans knew both cooperation and conflict, and they had learned hard lessons about living with their world, and they could help the jungle learn to communicate without accidentally destroying the minds of visitors. As the sun began to set, they prepared to return to camp, and the jungle gave them a gift and spores that would maintain the connection and allowing them to feel the jungle even at a distance, and they breathed in the spores willingly. Lisa said, "We will come back tomorrow, and we will start planning how to make you accessible to others, and how to protect you from those who would harm you." The jungle pulsed with approval, and as they walked back down the path, new flowers bloomed in their wake, and the predators watched from the shadows but did not threaten, and the whole jungle sang. When they reached camp, the other crew members knew immediately that something had changed, and they could see it in the eyes of those who had gone to the tree. Kevin said, "What happened out there?" Lisa smiled and said, "We made first contact, and now the real work begins." The next 3 days changed everything, and the crew that had drunk from the pool began teaching the others how to safely form the connection with the jungle. And Kevin was cautious at first, but his medical training made him curious. And when he finally accepted the spores and formed the connection, he spent an hour laughing and crying at the same time. The jungle learned quickly, and it understood now that its previous attempts to communicate had been too intense and too fast, and it had overwhelmed the minds of other species. And with the humans as guides, it practiced gentler methods and softer touches. Lisa spent her mornings by the fire writing reports to send to the Galactic Council, and explaining what they had discovered was not easy. And how could she describe a planet-sized consciousness that thought in seasons instead of seconds and communicated through chemistry and light and emotion? Rebecca worked with Jake to map the neural network that connected the jungle, and they found patterns that resembled brain structures, and there were areas that seemed to handle memory, and others that processed sensory information, and still others that appeared to be creative centers where new species were designed and grown. The jungle had been lonely for so long that it had started creating companions, and the predators and the birds and even the fish in the streams were all designed to be interesting and to provide stimulation. But they were not truly intelligent, and not in the way the jungle craved. Amy discovered she could communicate with the jungle through spark, and the little dragon had a natural talent for it, and he would fly through the canopy and return with images and sensations that the jungle wanted to share. And one day he came back with news that there was a storm approaching, and a big one. The jungle was concerned, and it remembered that storms had destroyed previous settlements, and it wanted to protect the humans, but did not know how. Lisa felt the worry through the connection and said, "We know about storms, and we have weathered them before, and we will prepare." The crew spent the afternoon securing equipment and reinforcing tents and gathering extra water and food, and the jungle watched with fascination as they worked together, and each person doing a specific task and all coordinating. Like a single organism, Nina noticed something strange and said, "The predators are gathering at the edge of the clearing, and there are dozens of them." Everyone tensed, but then they felt through the connection what the predators were doing, and they were forming a windbreak and using their bodies to protect the camp. Lisa was moved and said, "Thank you," and the jungle pulsed with something like pride. The storm hit at sunset, and it was violent and terrible, and wind screamed through the trees, and rain fell so hard it was like standing under a waterfall, and lightning turned the night into day, and thunder shook the ground. The jungle kept its promise, and the predators stood firm around the camp, and trees bent to shield the clearing, and vines grew over the tents, adding extra layers of protection, and the humans stayed dry and safe. Inside the largest tent, the crew gathered, and they could not sleep through the noise, so they told stories and sang songs and played games, and the dragons curled together in the center, providing warmth. Jake told a story about the first time humans met the dragon species and how everyone thought they were mindless beasts until one day a young girl offered a dragon some food, and the dragon had responded by protecting her village from a flood, and that act of friendship had changed history. Rebecca shared the story of Earth's great forests and how humans had almost destroyed them before learning to live in harmony. And she talked about the hard lessons and the mistakes and the slow, painful process of change. Amy talked about her childhood on Mars Colony and how lonely it had been until Spark hatched, and how the little dragon had taught her that family was not about biology, but about choice and love. Through the connection, the jungle absorbed these stories, and it understood more about humanity, and they were a species that made mistakes but learned from them, and they valued connection over conquest, and they believed in redemption. The storm lasted all night, and by morning it had passed, and the crew emerged to find the clearing transformed, and new streams had formed from the rainfall, and flowers bloomed everywhere, and the air was clean and fresh and smelled of ozone and growing things. The predators were gone and melted back into the forest, but at the edge of the clearing they had left gifts, and strange fruits and interesting stones, and the shed skin of some large creature that shimmered with colors. Lisa picked up one of the fruits and felt gratitude from the jungle, and she bit into it, and it tasted like strawberries and vanilla and something entirely new, and she smiled and said delicious. That afternoon, a message came from the ship in orbit, and the Galactic Council had reviewed Lisa's reports, and they were sending representatives to see for themselves, and 3 council members would arrive in 2 days. Lisa felt nervous, and the jungle felt it too, and asked through the connection if it should be worried. She said honestly, yes, and some species will not understand what you are, and they will be afraid, but we will help them see, and we will protect you. The jungle responded with trust, and it had learned that humans kept their promises. The crew spent the next 2 days preparing, and they created a presentation and gathered samples and rehearsed explanations, and Rebecca worked on a device that would allow non-connected individuals to safely experience a limited version of the jungle's consciousness. Jake discovered something important and said the jungle has been studying our technology, and it understands electricity now, and it wants to try something. That evening the jungle demonstrated, and lights began to glow throughout the clearing, and bioluminescent plants that the jungle had modified to respond to its will, and they pulsed in patterns and spelled out words in multiple languages, and welcome and friends and peace. Amy laughed and said, "You are showing off." The jungle pulsed with amusement, and yes. When the council representatives arrived, they were escorted down by shuttle, and the 3 members were a Centauri diplomat named Vex, who was tall and blue-skinned and cautious, and a Terralian scientist named Cora, who had 4 arms and compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not, and a void-born observer named Silence, who was ethereal and translucent, and rarely spoke. They stepped out of the shuttle and stopped, and the clearing was beautiful and welcoming and completely unlike the reports of previous expeditions. Vex said, "This is not a death world. And where are the predators and the hostile plants?" Lisa smiled and said, "They are here, and they are watching, and they are curious about you, and would you like to meet them?" Cora's translator device crackled and said, "We came prepared for danger and not hospitality." Rebecca stepped forward and said, "That is because no one understood what this planet was, and we have made first contact and with something remarkable. And let us show you." Over the next hours they explained and demonstrated and showed the council members the connection, and Cora was fascinated, and Vex was skeptical, and Silence was unreadable. When Rebecca offered them the chance to safely experience a limited connection, Cora agreed immediately, and Vex hesitated but eventually accepted, and Silence simply nodded. They drank the modified solution that Rebecca had created, and their eyes widened as they felt the jungle's presence. Cora made a sound of wonder in her own language, and Vex stood very still, and his expression changed from suspicion to awe, and Silence glowed brighter. Through the connection, the jungle greeted them and showed them kindness and curiosity and loneliness. When the connection faded, Vex said quietly, "I understand now, and this is not a world to be conquered, and this is a person, and we have been trying to invade someone's home." Cora said, "The scientific implications are staggering, and a planetary consciousness, and this should not be possible. And yet here it is." Silence spoke for the first time, and his voice was like wind through crystals, and said, "The universe is full of wonders, and this is one of the greatest, and humanity has done well. Lisa felt relief and said, "We propose that Verdania be declared a sovereign entity, and with full rights and protections, and humans will serve as ambassadors, and we will help the jungle learn to communicate with other species safely." Vex considered and said the council will need to vote, but I will recommend approval, and this is unprecedented, but so is humanity. That night they celebrated, and humans and dragons and council members and the jungle itself, and they shared food and stories and joy, and somewhere in the galaxy, the word began to spread that humans had done the impossible again. They had not conquered the death world, and they had befriended it. 6 months passed, and Verdania became the most talked about discovery in the galaxy, and species from every corner of known space wanted to visit and to experience the planetary consciousness, and to learn from the jungle that thought and felt. And remembered Lisa stood at the edge of the clearing that was no longer just a clearing, and it had grown into something new, and a place where the jungle met the stars, and there were buildings now, but not the sterile structures of previous attempts, and these were living architecture and trees shaped into shelters and vines that formed walkways and flowers that bloomed into rooms. The jungle had learned to build, and it created spaces for visitors, and comfortable and safe and beautiful, and each structure was unique and grown specifically for the species that would use it, and the Centauri preferred high spaces, so their buildings grew tall, and the Terralians needed multiple levels, so their quarters had floors connected by spiraling branches. Ember had grown larger, and her scales now shimmered with new colors that she had learned from the jungle, and sometimes green, and sometimes silver, and she could change them at will, and she spent her days flying through the canopy with the local creatures and teaching them games and joy. The dragons had become ambassadors in their own right, and Spark had discovered he could translate between the jungle and species that had trouble with the spore connection, and Cinder had learned to store the jungle's memories and could replay them like living history books, and Blaze had become the jungle's protector and working with the predators to keep everyone safe. Amy had taken on the role of tour guide, and she led groups through the jungle and showed them the wonders and taught them how to respect and communicate, and she had a gift for making even the most skeptical visitors understand. And one grumpy, void-born merchant had arrived complaining about wasted time and left, 3 days later in tears, saying it was the most profound experience of his long life. Rebecca had published 17 papers, and her research on the jungle's neural network had revolutionized understanding of consciousness and memory and collective intelligence, and universities across the galaxy were using Verdania as a case study, and she had been offered positions at the most prestigious institutions, but she turned them all down, saying she had more to learn here. Jake had cataloged over 10,000 species, and all created by the jungle over millions of years, and he discovered that the jungle was an artist, and it created beauty for its own sake, and there were birds with songs so complex they could express emotions, and flowers that changed colors based on who looked at them, and trees that grew in mathematical patterns that had no purpose except to be interesting. Kevin had treated visitors from 40 different species, and he learned that the connection affected everyone differently, and some experienced euphoria, and others felt peace, and a few found it overwhelming even with the gentler method, and he developed protocols to ensure safety, and the jungle worked with him and adjusting its approach for each species. Nina had trained the first interspecies security force, and humans and Centauri and Terralians and even some brave Voidborn, and working together to protect both the visitors and the jungle and the predators had become their partners, and the most effective security system in the galaxy was one that could think across an entire planet. The Galactic Council had voted unanimously to grant Verdania sovereign status, and it was the first non-humanoid, non-traditional consciousness to receive such recognition, and the jungle now had a vote in galactic affairs, and it used that vote to advocate for environmental protection and consciousness rights, and peaceful exploration. Lisa had been promoted to ambassador, and her official title was representative of Verdania, and she split her time between the planet and the council chambers and arguing for policies that protected unique worlds and unusual life forms, and she had become famous, and not for conquest but for friendship. One evening she sat by the central tree and the massive silver-barked giant that was the heart of the jungle, and Ember lay beside her. and they watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that Earth never had. Through the connection, she felt the jungle's contentment, and it was no longer lonely, and every day brought new visitors and new stories and new friends, and it had learned so much about the galaxy and about the countless ways that life could exist and think and feel. But it felt something else too, and gratitude. And the jungle had been waiting for millions of years for someone to understand and to see it not as a resource or a threat, but as a person. And humans, with their strange, adaptable minds and their capacity for empathy, had given it that gift. Lisa felt tears on her cheeks and said, "You gave us a gift too, and you showed us that consciousness can take forms we never imagined, and that friendship can bridge any gap." The jungle pulsed with affection, and then shared an image and a vision of the future and more planets like Verdania being discovered and more unique consciousnesses being found, and humans serving as ambassadors and bridges and helping the galaxy understand that intelligence came in infinite varieties. Amy approached with a group of young students and mixed species children who wanted to learn about Verdania, and Spark flew ahead of them, and the kids laughed and tried to catch him, and the little dragon played and dodged and made happy sounds. One of the children, and a small Terralian girl with bright purple skin, asked Amy why the humans were not afraid of the jungle. Amy knelt down and said, "Because we learned a long time ago that different does not mean dangerous, and our own world taught us that lesson, and we almost destroyed it before we understood." Another child and a human boy with dark curls said, "But the other species were afraid." Amy nodded and said yes, and because they saw something they did not understand, and they reacted with fear but humans have a saying, and it goes, what if, instead of asking what can we take, we ask what can we share? The children thought about this, and the Terralian girl said, "I like that, and can we share with the jungle?" Amy smiled and said, "You already are, and just by being here and by being curious and by being kind, and that is all it takes." The children ran off to explore, and carefully and respectfully, and the jungle grew soft, glowing paths for them to follow, and created gentle music from rustling leaves. Rebecca joined Lisa under the tree and said, "I got a message from Earth, and they want to create a program in training humans to work with unusual consciousnesses, and they are calling it the Verdania Initiative." Lisa said, "That is a good name, and we will need it. And the galaxy is full of mysteries, and who knows what else is out there, waiting to be understood." Jake came running up and excited and said, "You have to see this, and the jungle just created something new, and a flower that blooms only in the presence of music, and it is trying to learn art." They followed him to a grove where a group of musicians had been practicing, and on the ground were dozens of flowers that had not been there that morning. And as the music played, the flowers opened, and their petals formed patterns and visual representations of the sound. The musicians were amazed, and a Centauri flutist said, "It is listening, and it is showing us what our music looks like." The jungle pulsed with pleasure, and it loved learning new things. That night the settlement held a celebration, and 6 months of successful contact and of friendships formed, and of history made, and beings from across the galaxy gathered in the living amphitheater that the jungle had grown. There were speeches and music and food and laughter, and the dragons performed aerial displays, and the jungle created lights that danced through the canopy, and somewhere in the crowd, Vex, the skeptical Centauri diplomat, was teaching human children a traditional song from his world. Lisa looked around at the impossible scene and thought about the 17 expeditions that had failed, and they had come with weapons and walls and fear, and they had seen a death world. But humans had come with tents and campfires and curiosity, and they had seen a friend. That was the difference, and that was what humans brought to the galaxy, and not superior technology or strength or intelligence, but the simple, profound ability to look at something strange and ask, "What if we could be friends?" Ember nuzzled her hand, and Lisa scratched behind the dragon's horns and said, "We did good." The jungle responded with warmth and agreement and pride. Around them the celebration continued, and the first of many, and Verdania was no longer the graveyard of ambitions, and it was the birthplace of a new kind of relationship between species and worlds and ways of thinking. And somewhere in the deep forest, and in the heart of the ancient consciousness, and the jungle dreamed, and for the first time in millions of years, and they were not dreams of solitude. They were dreams of connection and of growth and of a future, where the lonely were found and the different were celebrated and the impossible became routine, because humans had gone camping on a death world, and they had shown the galaxy that sometimes the scariest monsters just needed a friend, and that understanding was worth more than conquest, and that the universe was big enough for all kinds of minds. The stars shone above and the jungle sang below and in the space between, and humanity and dragons and one very old, very grateful planetary consciousness proved that kindness could change everything, and they all lived and grew and learned together. And that was enough, and that was everything.